So our last group of Sarcoropterygiae, so our lobe fin fishes, is the tetrapods. So tetra meaning four, and then pod meaning foot, are going to be organisms that have an ancestor who had four limbs. There are going to be several of these groups that actually lose their legs as a development later on. These four limbs are going to have feet with digits. So you can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Exceptionally, all over, most groups of tetrapods are going to settle on 5 digits on the feet, and we don't really have a good understanding of why 5 is the magic number for digits. We're going to start to see a neck. So if you think about a fish, right, a fish doesn't have a neck, right? There's my fish, right? There's no neck here. Now we start to see this neck, which is going to allow them to move the head and the body separately, which is going to come in handy. We start to see more structure and fusion in the pelvic girdle. This is important because amphibians are going to start the movement of these vertebrate animals onto land, which means that we're going to have to deal with gravity, and we need to have a little bit more structure and support for our limbs to be able to propel us around on Earth. The absence of gills, again, this is going to be an adaptation for moving onto land. Start to see other methods like lungs for acquiring oxygen, as well as ears. So the first inner ear bone is going to develop here in the amphibians and reptiles, and then we'll see 3 inner ear bones later in the mammals. So the first group of the tetrapods is, so here's our tetrapods right here, all 3 of these, and the first group in here are the amphibia, and these are going to be tetrapods that don't have an amniotic egg. So amphibians are going to, amphi means both, so this means both, and then bia means life. So amphibia means both ways of life. So these are typically going to be found in both aquatic and terrestrial environments. A lot of these individuals start out as aquatic and then move on to land as they develop into adulthood. So that's where we get amphibio. But that means that their eggs are attached to water. So they don't have any kind of covering on their eggs that's going to protect them from drying out. So there's 3 main groups. There's Urodela, which means tailed ones, and that includes
my teacher is happy now.
Yay. And that means tailed ones, and that's going to include the salamanders. So most salamander larvae actually look a little like this guy. They'll have a big larval tail though, and then it will grow into adults to look more like this one on the right and become terrestrial. This salamander here is actually an adult. This is axolotl, which is a very cute aquatic salamander that actually retains its gills here and stays underwater. Anura, so whenever we use an, it means without. So euro is tail. So euro is tailless. So these are the frogs. And they do start out as tadpoles, which live in aquatic environments with tails and gills, and they lose those and develop legs, and then move on to land. And frogs are going to be extremely good at moving around on land because they can jump. Toads are frogs that have keratinized skin. So keratin is the protein in your hair and nails and skin that helps to keep you waterproofed. So a toad is going to be able to survive in kind of a drier environment than a frog. All toads are frogs, but not all frogs are toads. They typically have skin glands that can secrete a mucus to help kind of moisten the skin. Some frogs actually excrete like a poison. So this is a poison dart frog right here, and it's bright yellow, and that's called aposomatic coloring, and it's a warning, and that says that I'm poisonous. And they're not actually inherently poisonous. The poison they pick up is from the ants that they eat. So you can raise poison dart frogs and feed them different ants, and they won't become poisonous. And then the last group is Sicilian. So this is apoda, which means legless ones. And these look a little bit like an earthworm, but they don't have the segmentations. These are actually amphibians, and they typically live in tropical areas in the soil, so they'll kind of live in the same environment as an earthworm and burrow in the soil. And so this is an example of convergent evolution. We're going to see leglessness a lot. So we'll see it again in reptiles with snakes. We saw it with all of the different worms. So organisms that kind of live on the ground, that live underground, tend to lose their legs because they don't necessarily need them. And it's maybe an advantage to not have legs. These are pretty close to blind. You can see the eyes are really small and very reduced. So if I'm living underground, I probably don't need very good vision or very good eyes. So why spend the energy making eyes? Amphibians, because they live in both aquatic and terrestrial environments, go through this metamorphosis, kind of like what we saw in insects. So we start with these larval tadpoles, which have this kind of very much like a fish structure, where they have gills, they have legs, they have a tail. And so as they mature, they start to lose that tail, and then they start to sprout these little limbs, and then you can see his little face is starting to look a lot more like a frog. And then eventually they can crawl up on land and start hopping around and being terrestrial adults. Amphibians do still typically have to mate in the water because their eggs are not amniotic. They don't have shells or protective layers. So this is called amplexus, where this is external mating. The male is back here in the top and the female's down here. So what happens is the female lays unfertilized eggs, and then as they're laid, the male fertilizes them externally. Most of them are laid in the water. There are some very unique frogs that will retain their eggs on their skin, some in their mouth. Some of them will actually swallow them and keep them in their stomach until they're ready to hatch. A lot of tree frogs will lay these kind of foamy nests up in trees because they're a little far away from the water, so they have to kind of create their own little moist environment here.